back to operating. Smooth for the next 15, 20 minutes. And then she asked for something different, put her hand out. Wrong instrument. This time, her response was, "For God's sake, I thought you knew how to do this. Just give me what I bloody need. Come on." Got what she needed. Went back to operating. It became clear to people in theatre that the scrub practitioner was upset, possibly distressed. And it was one of those as if by magic moments where the circulating sister turned up in theatre and made a decision. She decided to remove the scrub practitioner and replace them with somebody different. And that's what she did. Apparently without the surgeon ever noticing, and that's understandable if you're really focused on what you're doing. And the rest of that operation went without anything worth noting. Again, for the next operation, by the time of the third operation, and they did have time to do it, by the time of the third operation, the initial scrub practitioner was feeling composed and wanted to come back in for that operation. The circulating sister thought that was probably the right thing to do, and so they swapped them in. Excuse me. The final operation took slightly longer than was expected, but they still finished on time. It was slightly bloodier than expected. But they finished up. There were no difficult moments, particularly within it. They finished up. Everybody had done the counts. Everybody signed out. The patient went to recovery, and the team left. They left to go to do whatever they were going to do that Tuesday afternoon. We never saw the first two patients in the emergency department, but we did see the third one. She came back to us once. She was complaining of a bit of sore abdomen, but she had normal obs, normal examination. We saw her, the surgeons saw her, because that's what happens in emergency departments when somebody comes back post-operatively. And we all felt that she was okay, and we safety netted her and sent her home. She came back a second time. Again, normal obs, normal examination. We saw her, the surgeons saw her. Again, we safety netted her and sent her home, because some people just have a slightly rougher post-operative experience. On the third time she came back, things were a bit different. She still had the normal obs. She still examined pretty much the same normally. But she told us a story that was a wee bit different. She told us that at home she'd had some shaky episodes, that she'd had some sweaty episodes. And we know that those episodes, call them rigors, we know that those episodes can be indicative of a deep-seated infection. And in conjunction with our surgical colleagues, we decided to do a CT scan of her abdomen and pelvis. Now, where I work, if you ask for an emergency CT scan, you generally get it within about 20 minutes in the emergency department, and you get a verbal report back about 15 to 20 minutes after that. And it's a brilliant, brilliant piece of team working that's going on there. And she went off for her scan, and right enough, 15 minutes after she came back, we got a call, and the call was from the radiology registrar. And what he said was, "I can't be sure, but I think there's something in her pelvis." And we looked at it, the surgeons looked at it, the surgeons took her off to the ward, and then they took her to theatre, and she ended up having a laparotomy. So big opening. They looked in, and they discovered that at operation, we had left behind a large gauze swab, not a small one, a large one. That was removed, and the patient did absolutely fine after that. There was, of course, a DATEX, an incident form. And then there was, of course, a discussion about this. There was actually quite a long discussion about whether or not this was a never event, which is just a comment for people who do governance, who might be interested that other places discuss whether or not things like this are never events. But whether it was or whether it wasn't, we decided that we would do a root cause analysis. That's what we did. We did this big investigation, root cause analysis, and what did we find? Well, we found that the scrub practitioner hadn't been competent, that the scrub practitioner needed to go on a course to learn to count swabs, and that the scrub practitioner shouldn't be allowed to practice until they'd proven themselves able to count swabs. And I think we missed the point. I think we missed the point. I think we missed the chance to be better. And probably, worst of all, I think that in exactly the same circumstances, we may well get exactly the same outcomes. So healthcare is a team business. We deliver it in complicated and sometimes complex environments, and we do it with varying outcomes. And for 10 of the last 14 years, as well as being an emergency medicine consultant, I've been a governance lead, investigating and trying to understand what's happened in situations like the one that I've just described. And if you'd come to me at the beginning of that time and you said, Chris, what's the issue? I would have been completely clear. I would have said, it's process. If only everybody did what they're meant to do. But there's a problem with that. And the problem's this, that once you start to investigate situations like the one I've just described, you find that, or I found, that the people at the end of this chain with the supposedly smoking gun, those people are often good, hardworking, knowledgeable, frequently very kind individuals. Exactly the sort of people that I want to work with and that I want to look after me and mine if they get sick. And I gradually came to realize that I must be missing something. And it was a slow process. But what I think I was missing is this, that process is written down on a piece of paper. But practice happens between you and me, and it happens in an environment. And I simply wasn't respecting the complexity that adds into the process. So now if people ask me what I think the issue is, what I think the answer is, I still think process is important. I think it's really important that we would understand how we do something on the perfect day with a good following wind and all the rest of it. But something else is more important. And that's people and how we treat each other. And I think the evidence bears me out on this. But for clarity, I'm not here today to talk about the avoidance of error. It is in the nature of healthcare that if the thing that drives us is never, ever, ever, ever making a mistake, the only way of achieving that for the vast majority of us is when we waken up in the morning to waking up and say, I don't want to make a mistake in any way today, is to then pick up your phone, turn on your phone into work, put on sick voice and tell them you're not coming. Because every day of our work, we have to make decisions, judgment decisions, and it is in the nature of those that every so often one of those will go wrong. So I'm not here to talk about the avoidance of error. What I'm here to talk about is how do we create cultures where people have a chance of performing at their personal peak? How do we create cultures where people have a chance of working together to create the best outcomes for patients, for staff, and also for organizations? Right. So I already mentioned that healthcare is a team business and we deliver it in complicated and sometimes complex environments, and we do it with varying outcomes. And that's easy to say. And it's actually a wee bit glib. But what do I mean when I'm talking about complexity? And I think this is worth pushing around for a few minutes, because I wouldn't have been able to talk about this if you'd come and talk to me, say, 7 or 8 years ago. I wouldn't have had a starting place around this. But then I went to a talk by a guy called David Rook. David Rook doesn't work strictly in healthcare. He's a management consultant and he works for Hartsell Consulting. And he talked, as part of his talk, about complexity. And it was revelatory for me. So what I'd like to do is show you a wee bit of a version of the graph that he showed us, and then take you to the place that we've gone to afterwards with this in terms of thinking about how this impacts upon us and healthcare. We've got to tell you the graph's a wee bit ugly and very, very slightly counterintuitive because we're going from a line from with certainty about the solution to a problem from high to low certainty. I'm going to put 4 boxes in this and we'll talk about each as we go along. Excuse me. Simple puzzles. 2 plus 2. We all agree what the problem is. We all agree what the answer is. So high certainty about the solution to the problem. Hard puzzle. Sudoku. Don't know how to do it. Somebody would need to teach me. But once they've taught me, I know that there's easy ones and fiendishly difficult ones. But you can do it on your own. And then there's complicated. Classic example of a complicated problem is a liver transplant. You may have all the skills required to do the liver transplant and every bit of it, but that doesn't really matter because so many things need to happen simultaneously. What that means is we have to work with other people. You can't do it on your own. But the idea is that we all know what we're aiming for. Now, what I see as a problem in that setting and what you see as a problem in that setting might be different. Even if we completely agree what the problem is, my solution and your solution are almost certainly going to be different to that problem. And that's because we've got different skill sets. But as I say, we are all going in the same direction. And then there's complex. The classic example of complex that was discussed when I went to this lecture was Syria. Lots of different people think lots of different things are the problems. They've got lots of different solutions. But what they're aiming for is often in a different direction. The classic example that was used at that time about healthcare was the 4-hour target. Now, my organisation could hit the 4-hour target. We could probably even do it without all the gaming that goes on across the whole of England, and I couldn't comment on you guys, of adding as many people into the denominator of this problem as possible. But we could probably hit the 4-hour target. But if we were to do that, it would have knock-on effects on lots of other services. Pretty quickly, we would stop having elective surgery coming in. Pretty quickly, we would get to the stage of closing down a few of the outpatient clinics, and eventually we'd get to the stage where we were stopping radiotherapy and chemotherapy. And that's because the system would start to absorb more and more of the available resource, just aiming in one direction, when actually we have a whole bunch of other things that we need to be doing as well. So we have complex problems in lots of different ways. But the kind of key thing is that people are either aiming for something and causing a lot of chaos or a lot of problems in another bit of the system, or they're going in different directions. So then what I would ask you is, where do we get our results in healthcare? And I would put it to you that we get a lot of credibility and we test on simple puzzles and hard puzzles. Because we test people, and pretty much every exam I've ever done has been like this, more or less. We test people in exam halls when they go in and they sit down and there's a question. And there's one right answer to this question and a myriad of wrong answers. And we test people on their ability to be the person who has the right answer. And that's all about personal mastery. That's all about me. What's in my head? Pretty much all my postgraduate exams were like that. What's in my head? Do I know this stuff? But I would put it to you that whilst that credibility is clearly important, where we get results in healthcare tends to be in the complicated and complex world, which isn't about personal mastery. It's about team mastery. It's about who we are to each other and how we interact and how we achieve things together. And I would also put it to you that the skill set for personal mastery and the skill set for team mastery are different. The important thing I would like to say about that is that they're not mutually exclusive. It's possible to have personal mastery and team mastery. It's just that we put an awful lot of weighting into personal mastery, and we maybe don't put so much into understanding teams and how we work together. So a couple of things happen as we go up this graph. And by the way, we're now into the stuff that we've added to this. The first is pretty self-evident. You can't do it on your own. So there's an increasing need for teamwork as we go up the graph from the simple puzzle through to the complex. Second one's a wee bit different. So this is Shuli. I'm married to Shuli. She is an emergency medicine consultant. She is, by her own admission, smarter than me. She's certainly senior to me. She's the clinical director of 2 acute and 2 emergency departments here in Birmingham. And this is a picture of her when we went on our last big holiday, which was 4 years ago, just before COVID. And this is her in Chicago, and I think it's a lovely picture. And Shuli and I have lots in common. So, you know, house, cars, children, that sort of stuff, bills, lots of bills. And we share loads of professional background. But we're obviously also different. So I'm a squat, middle-aged, beardy Welsh man. I'm not Welsh, I'm Scottish. She's Welsh. That's not good, is it? But Shuli is Welsh. She's Bangladeshi. And she's Muslim. She grew up in the valleys in Wales. And we have different backgrounds. I grew up in Edinburgh. And we used to say to people, if you want to see something from somebody else's perspective, you should imagine what it's like for them. And I'm sure that most of us have had discussions where people have said that to us. There's a problem with it, though, and there's a couple of very elegant psychology experiments about this, that just imagining how things are from somebody else's perspective doesn't really work. This is why. So Chris sees problem, right? I look at it, I go, aha, that's how the problem looks. Well, how would Shuli see this problem? And I mentally swing my lens around and I look at it from a different angle and I go, ah, so that's how Shuli sees it. Welsh, Bangladeshi, Muslim, that's how she sees it. Only it's not. That's how I imagine that she would see it. And all the work on unconscious bias tells us this, that you swing your lens round, you think you see it from somebody else's perspective, but all your unconscious biases are still in play. And even the best unconscious bias training doesn't get rid of our unconscious biases. What it does is makes us aware that we have them. And it turns out that if you want to know what somebody else thinks about a problem or want to know how they see it, there isn't a shortcut. You have to do 2 things. First one is that we have to ask them how they see something. And the second is that we need to listen to their answer. And that sounds really simple, doesn't it? Except for what's the currency at play when we're doing that? Currency is time. And we are all time short. And we want the shortcut. But when we want to know what other people think, there really doesn't seem to be one. And what happens as we listen to other people's perspectives, as we gather more information, is that sometimes that answer that we saw at the beginning of when we looked at the problem, sometimes that's not the right answer. Sometimes as we get more and more information, the right answer changes, and that means that we need to do something that we don't really get marks for in exams. That's compromise or change our minds. And that can be an extremely difficult thing for some people to get their heads around, that it's that the right thing changes as we have more information in a complicated and complex world, and that we don't have all the answers for that stuff in our own heads. And what we know about this is that in complicated and complex situations, the most important factor determining performance, if you have a competent team, the most important factor is how much information do they choose to share. Now, that probably doesn't matter so much in the simple puzzles, hard puzzles, because down that end of the graph, what's going on is you just know it or you don't, or you can work it out. But in the complicated and complex stuff, there's things we don't know. And I'd like to just give you a quick model around this. This is called the pool of information. It's a model that we've been working up with Joanne Guri, who is the professor of linguistics in Warwick. And basically it goes like this. This pool of information, this empty pool, represents the problem, this complicated or complex problem. And as we walk up to it, suddenly there's just a wee bit of water in the bottom of the pool. And that's what we brought to it. That's what we know already. But we can get more information. So we can invite people to stand around this pool. And each one of them might be in a position to contribute. And you can choose who you have standing around the pool. Sometimes you get no choice. But you can often choose who stands around this pool. And you can choose a bunch of people who look like you, think like you, who have the same values as you, who are maybe the same sex, race, religion, colour, and you can have them standing around this pool. And you'll have quite an easy conversation, and they'll probably contribute in that setting, but you'll kind of get the same information over and over and over again. I mean, I could have a whole bunch of squat, middle-aged, beardy, Scottish, slightly angry men standing around this with the same political background and whatever. And we could stand around this and have a conversation, but I will just hear that perspective over and over. Or we can invite people to stand around the pool who represent difference, who represent different colours, sex, sexuality, race, religion, values. We can invite those people, different ways of thinking. We can invite those people to stand around the pool. And that's clearly an argument for equality and diversity. Now, the evidence on this is that if you do get those people standing around the pool, then you have the chance to make better decisions. McKinsey do work on this about financial decisions, but there's lots of other work done on this that shows that when we have equality and diversity, then we have a better chance of getting better answers and understanding the problems better, which is a large part of what this is about. But I would put it to you that having these people standing around the pool, these people who represent all this difference, at that point it is the illusion of equality and diversity. Because every single one of them has their own tap. And they choose to turn on their tap with their flow of information or turn off their tap and their flow of information. And they do it depending on one factor more than anything else. And that is, do they feel valued and respected in this group? When people feel valued and respected, they turn on the flow of information and we get richer information into the pool of information. When they feel disrespected or that their way of seeing things is not valued, then they tend to turn it off and we just don't hear what they think. And hopefully that's of some use. That idea, that way of thinking about equality and diversity. By the way, it doesn't make the conversations easier. Having people who see things from different perspectives actually makes conversations a wee bit more difficult, sometimes a wee bit abrasive, and that's something we have to be thinking about. Now, forgive me, just a quick drink. When we're working in this complicated and complex zone, by definition, we really need to be working in teams. But what makes for the best teams? And there's lots of different work done on this. You can look at what helps individuals to perform at their personal peak, because it makes sense that you'd want people to be at their personal peak within a team so that the team could collectively work at their peak. And you think about physiology, we think about hydration, we can think about eating, we can think about sleep. We know that you can measure cognitive decline at 1% dehydration. It starts to become easily measurable at that level. We used to think that when people got 5 to 10% dehydrated, there was a 10 to 20% drop off in executive function. But more recent evidence says that's wrong. That actually we get the 10 to 20% drop off in executive function at between 3 and 10% dehydration, 3 and 5% dehydration, sorry. So this is happening much earlier than we thought. And I think many people would recognize that. You're feeling a bit tired, a bit sluggish, and you drink a few glasses of water, and suddenly your brain feels like it's working better again, because it is. We know that sleep is important. If you keep people up all night, it changes the profile of the decision making that they go through. They make faster, riskier decisions when they've been up all night. In fact, being up all night is equivalent of being about twice over the drink drive limit. And that's the English drink drive limit. And pretty much everybody knows somebody who, when they've not had something to eat, are perhaps not quite the best versions of themselves. And then they get something to eat and they're fine again. But that's just looking at the individuals. What about looking at teams as a collective? And up until recently, the best evidence, and arguably is still the best evidence around the performance of teams in healthcare, came from Michael West. So Michael West, Professor of Leadership at Lancaster University and also at the King's Fund in London. And he's lovely and does amazing work. And if you haven't watched stuff by him, I'd really commend it, particularly watching one of his sort of longer videos of him giving a lecture. And there's loads on YouTube. So Michael West he's a lovely person, but he's also got a brilliant mind. And what he does is he and his team take the NHS staff survey data, the biggest survey of healthcare staff in the world, and they correlate it with organizational and down to departmental level performance. And you can actually look at this at ward level as well. And he can show the factors that result in good teams or that are correlated with being in a good team. And I'll give you some examples. So the maximum number of people in a team for everybody to be heard is 8 or 9. Once you get beyond that, people don't feel heard so well in that team. He can show that the best teams have away days. Now, I have no idea what your organization is like in terms of its attitude towards away days, but mine seems to regard away days as a kind of a jolly, a nice to have that you should probably get if you're performing really well. And yet, Michael West's work can show that teams that have away days have a productivity boost in the region of the mid-30s in terms of percent, and that's mind-blowing. But the bit that I'd like to talk about for the next few minutes is another piece of his work. Excuse me, another piece of his work. And that's about what sort of team are you in? Are you in a real team or a pseudo team? Because it turns out that 98% of us in the NHS believe that we work in a team, but only 40% of us are in real teams. The other 60 work in pseudo teams. And what's the difference? Well, real teams, there's a bunch of differences, but the main one for me is that real teams can tell you what it is that they are trying to achieve here today, this week, this year, and they agree on that. And pseudo teams can't. Real teams perform it greater than the sum of their parts, on average. And on average, pseudo teams don't. And that seems crazy. How come only 40% of us in the NHS work in real teams? Seems crazy till I think about my world. Now, I work in a big old emergency department. Before COVID, we were seeing up to about 700 patients a day. And I measure myself on my ability to provide good, high quality care and hopefully excellence in resource. And I measure my colleagues on the same thing, and they measure me on that. But I work alongside a bunch of people who I like very much, but who are not measured on the same thing. And those are my non-clinical managerial colleagues. And they are measured on the 4-hour target performance. And they're hung, they're drawn, and they are quartered on the basis of 4-hour target performance. And I would put it to you that when the 4-hour target came along, that the 4-hour target and good patient care aligned really quite nicely. But then, I'm going to tell you my English experience of this. Then we had 10, 11 years of austerity. Every single year, by the way, we got told that next year you'd have less patients coming because of all the new things that were being put in place to avoid patients coming to the emergency department. And guess what happened every single year until COVID came along? More patients. And slowly the two things spread apart until eventually we got to this place where we can hit the target, but completely miss the point of care. And we have a bunch of people who are aiming down this route and a bunch of people who are going in that route. And that gap between competing interests, the gap that sits in here, it manifests itself as tension, sometimes hostility, occasionally even worse. And it's brutal when people are pulling away in different directions, particularly when you don't have a lot of resource. And in the NHS in England, we have the best stroke worst ever example of this, and that's mid-staffs. So in mid-staffs, and I worked there, so I'm intimately familiar with it, far more familiar with it than I would like to be in some levels. In mid-staffs, we the clinicians were trying to provide the best care that we could. The doctors and nurses were trying, and the allied healthcare professional, trying to provide the best care that we could. They, the exec team, were interested in one thing, and that was finance. We, let's be brutally honest here, we thought that they were bastards. They thought that we were naive idiots. We dug in our trenches, and we chucked crap at each other more and more and more and more. And eventually there was a healthcare commission inquiry, and eventually a whole bunch of other inquiries, two Francis inquiries. And what was the consequence of that divergence? Well, patients suffered, staff suffered, and eventually the organisation itself got dissolved. And I'd put it to you that in part that was because we didn't really speak to each other. We just fought. We both thought the other side were numpties of whatever type. And lest I leave people with the idea that I think that the exec team were bad people, I really, really don't. I got to know those guys very well. And I would say that every one of them was a good person, but they were measured on one thing, and that was the financial performance. And it wasn't without threat, because the board in Stoke, which is the next hospital up the M6, the board in Stoke failed a financial stress test, and they were sacked en masse the next week. And these guys are like us. They've got houses, cars, bills, all the rest of it. They couldn't afford to lose their jobs. And they were only being measured on one thing, which was finance. So it's no surprise that that's the direction that they went in. I do think that we could have managed it lots better, and primarily through talking to each other and having a clear narrative about what it was that we were trying to achieve, and maybe sharing goals. And what Michael West's work can show us is that if we can take the percentage of people who are in real teams, and this is English data, in real teams from 40% to 65%, then in the NHS in England, we would save between 4,000 and 12,000 lives a year. How does that come about? Well, here's the first bit. When we're going in different directions and we're expending all that energy fighting, that energy that we expend fighting is kind of wasted energy. If you can get goal alignment and people can go in the same direction, you get that energy back into the system. So people are putting more patient-facing work into the system. But the second thing's a wee bit hidden in that, and that is that going to work in a war zone is utterly demotivating, and people put in less and less effort. When people agree the reason why they're at work and go on a trajectory where everyone's going on that trajectory, then you get a second bonus, and that's called discretionary effort. And people choose to give more of themselves to the workplace when they feel that they're doing meaningful work and they're not in conflict with other people. And that's just genuinely a win-win if we can get people into that position, because people enjoy it more as well. So they get more out of work, they put more into work, and we get better outcomes. And I think that's worth thinking about. But Michael West's work is correlation. And within healthcare, what we really like is actually not correlation. We like a randomized controlled trial. There weren't any. There weren't any randomized controlled trial in the performance of teams in healthcare until 2015. And in 2015, Riskin and Eris published the first of their landmark papers. Now, their study was about the performance of neonatal teams in a simulated peri-arrest situation for a newborn baby. And obviously, you can only really do these things in simulations, but when you do them in simulation, you can measure all sorts of things. You can measure time to diagnosis, accuracy of diagnosis, time to decision to doing first life-saving intervention, and ability to do that first life-saving intervention. You can take teams, and this is what they did. They took teams of doctors and nurses who were matched for ability, and they put them through a whole bunch of simulations. And this is what they found. They found that there was variation in outcomes in these situations. And these are complicated or complex situations because teams have to work together. And they varied from the catastrophic outcomes to the truly amazing outcomes. And that one factor was responsible for where you sat on that graph, or responsible for 40 to 60% of the variance in where you sat in that graph. And that's information sharing. Teams that shared information had better outcomes. Teams that shared less information had, in general, worse outcomes. And the most important factor determining whether or not people would share information: civility, respect. When teams treated each other in a civil, respectful fashion, they shared more information. When they treated each other in an uncivil fashion, they shared less information and outcomes were poorer. And in this situation, in the pool of information, you're not choosing who's in your team, because these are emergency situations. You get who you get. But how people treated each other determined whether or not the teams would turn on the flow of information or turn off the flow of information. And what this says is that how we behave towards each other seems to be about the single most important factor determining how well teams perform. In fact, how well competent teams perform. But as we'll see in a few minutes, you can drive a competent team into incompetence through behavior. So let's talk about incivility for a few minutes. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, if it's such a big deal, how come I went to Edinburgh Medical School in the 1980s? And Edinburgh Medical School in the 1980s felt to me like a dirty, great Victorian incivility factory. We manufactured incivility and arrogance on industrial scales, and then actually mostly exported it to England. I think other universities were the same at the time, certainly from my conversations with many of my peers from other places. But Edinburgh certainly felt like that. Then I did my membership in emergency medicine and my membership in surgery, and nobody ever mentioned how we treated each other. And I did my fellowship in emergency medicine, and not once did anybody talk about the importance of how we behave towards each other in a healthcare environment. And there's a reason for that. This is new science. Between 1996 and 2001, in the whole of academia, there were 23 papers on the impact of behavior on performance. Between 2011 and 2016, there were 1,700, and they pretty much all say the same thing, that this stuff matters. But I should check. You guys ever seen rudeness at work? Maybe to you, maybe to somebody near you. Maybe it's even been by you, and it's been by me far too many times. But think for a second when it was to you, when somebody was rude to you. How did it feel? Just take a moment to think about how it felt. Because I think for a bunch of folk out there, you'll remember feeling angry about somebody speaking to you like that. But the evidence around this is really interesting because in the moment when somebody treats us poorly, particularly if it's down a hierarchy, in the moment we tend not to feel angry. We feel belittled, ashamed. That's a weird thing to feel. We feel humiliated. We feel powerless and we feel childlike. And then gradually, over time, sometimes seconds, sometimes minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, even years, gradually we make sense of it. And we get to that place where we go, how dare you? How dare you treat me like that? How dare you say those things to me? When either I didn't deserve it at all and it made no sense, or I was just doing the best that I could do at that moment in the circumstances with what I knew and the resources I had. But we don't start there. We start in that belittled, ashamed, humiliated place. And how do people respond to rudeness? Well, it turns out that over 90% of us, over 95% of us, want to get even. I put this up for the orthopods to entertain them. They want to get even. But that hides a statistic. And what it hides is this, that over 80% of people are happy to get even with somebody else, not necessarily the person who's rude to them. They're happy to get even with somebody else who represents the organization that the person who's rude to them is seen to represent, particularly if they feel that they strongly are representatives of it. Like anybody who's working for the NHS might be seen as being a representative of the NHS. And what this means is that if we have people out there who are creating a lot of unhappiness, they leave this comet tail behind them. And the comet tail is of other people who are getting kind of drive-by incivility coming at them because someone's getting even with the person who was rude to them 2 interactions ago. And that's a reason why just letting people be like that in the workplace is perhaps not the best thing that we can do. There are 4 distinct groups of people who are impacted upon by rudeness. I am going to just really go through 2 of them and a wee bit on the third one. And to do it, I'm going to talk about working memory. So it's this place where we come up with our creative solutions to problems, and we're doing this all the time. On a good day with a following wind, we have 5 to 7 things that sit in there. Some of them are concepts, some of them are numbers, and we toss them around, and then we come up with our great answer. And what happens to that? What happens to that working memory when people are treated in a disrespectful, negative way? And by the way, I'm talking here, I'm not talking about screaming and shouting and hostility. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I'm talking about the mild to moderate rudeness. I'm talking about the people who roll their eyes at you when you're talking in a conversation, the leader who rolls their eyes at you. I'm talking about the people who finish your sentences for you when they couldn't possibly know what you were going to say at the end of your sentence, and the people who correct your English halfway through a sentence, which incidentally means they were listening to the grammar, not to the message that you're trying to send. I'm talking about that stuff. And Christine Porath, Amy Herrera has looked at this, and what they found was that mild to moderate rudeness, particularly down hierarchy, leads to a 61% reduction in cognitive ability, squeezing down that working memory. And what probably happens is that we divert our cognitive resources rather than going into the logical bit of our brain. What we're doing is we're perceiving people treating us negatively as a threat. And that means that we're sending some resource into basically the getting ready to rumble center, where we are thinking, do I need to be ready to have a fight with this person? Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense when you say it out loud, but our brains at a very base level don't really make a lot of sense unless you look upon everything as possible threat and trying to stay alive. If these interactions, though, have such a significant impact on our ability to think, then that has all sorts of implications. And one of them is this, you have one of these interactions at the beginning of the day, and in the moment you don't enjoy it. You go, what the hell was that? And then you intermittently think about it through the day, and it goes through your head, and it comes back, and it goes, and it comes back. Then you get to the end of the day, and you get in the car, and you're driving home and you stop at the lights, and you know these lights take 2 or 3 minutes to change, and you're sitting there, you're on your own, you're safe, your bandwidth is opened up, and you have that moment when you go, boom, if I'd said that right there, right then, they would have known just how smart I am. If I'd said that right there, right then, they wouldn't speak to me like that again. I really wish I'd said it, and you're kicking yourself because you didn't say it. But there's a reason why we don't say that. There's a reason why we don't think of that in that moment. And that is because in the moment when somebody treats us like that, we are literally cognitively less and we can't think of it. We think of it in the car on the way home because at that moment our bandwidth is opened up and we're back in this space where we can think about stuff. But in the moment, we are literally cognitively a wee bit less. And this has all sorts of further implications. I mean, one of them is that if it's important to me to be the smartest guy in the room and I'm the boss, I can do that. I can do that by every time somebody talks in the room, I can talk over them, I can roll my eyes at them, I can correct their English, I can finish the end of their sentences for them. And each time I do it, I will squeeze the bandwidth of somebody down. And I can do it lots of different times. And eventually, if I keep doing that enough, I will become the smartest guy in the room because I've diminished everybody else. And that might be good for my ego, but it's not good for the people I work with, and it's not good for patient care. And I think many of us have met bosses who have behaved in that way. And I have to say, I don't think that any of them deliberately behave that way. I don't think they behave that way to diminish others. I think they behave that way because they've had that role model to them as a form of leadership. And my experience of this is that when we get into talking about it, that people, once they recognize the impact that this has, then they choose to change and they don't behave in that way going forward, for the most part. Then there's the impact on staff onlookers. There's a story in one of my TED Talks about myself and the neurosurgical registrar, which is a wee bit embarrassing, but I'm going to tell you a different embarrassing story in a minute or two. So I'm not going to tell you that one. But what happened was people didn't think that there was much of an impact on staff onlookers when they see two people having a negative interaction. But it turns out that there is. And that on average, that's a 20% decrease in cognitive performance. That hides another statistic. And this guy called Gaddy Gillam did some work on this a couple of years ago, which shows that that's not evenly distributed, that 20% decrease in performance. He looked at empathy, and empathy is a normal distribution. So there's people who are super empathic and people who are not very empathic. And unsurprisingly, when you look at that, you find that the people who are not very empathic are not really affected by seeing other people having a negative interaction, but the people who are super empathic are significantly more. And that has lots of implications, but one of them that's really important from my perspective is, who do we want to work in healthcare? And I'd put it to you that we want people who are empathic, particularly in nursing. We tell people who are really empathic, you'd be a lovely nurse, you'd be a really good nurse. If we're selecting out people to come and work in nursing who sit at this end of the spectrum, and then we have environments where people treat each other like crap, that's then going to have more of a negative impact on their ability to perform than it would if we had a whole bunch of cold fish. There's lots of other things that happen around this. One of them is that, if you get up, if you're exposed to this and you get up and you go around the corner and you've just witnessed it and somebody asks you for help, you're a full 50% less likely to help that person around the corner. This stuff is simply contagious in civility. But there's one group of people who are more likely to be rude than anybody else, and there's real lack of evidence around the impact of this. But we do know that this group are more likely to be rude than anybody else, and that's bosses or people in authority. Dacher, Keltner, Paul Pith, a bunch of other people look at this. Once you become a boss, you are on average 3 times more likely to sit in a meeting using your laptop for something other than that meeting. You're 3 times more likely to interrupt people, and you're 3 times more likely to raise your voice at them. But there's some good news as well. And the good news is this, that the people who go on to be regarded as wise do not stay like that. if they ever were that way, but they probably were. People who go on to be regarded as wise change. They go from being people who tell others what to do to being people who are asking other people for their opinion. And what they're doing is they're moving what Edgar Sheen says as moving from telling to asking. They are asking, not telling. And what these guys are doing, people who regard as being wise, although wisdom comes from within us, the information to make wise decisions comes from outside us. And they are filling the pool of information. People are in wise situations. Super quickly, I'm going to tell you a story about the impact on leaders of rudeness. And do you know what? I'll finish off and I'll tell you the story about the impact on leaders of rudeness because it's not hard data and it's a story about me. And I know some people might need to go in a minute or two. So I want to get through just a wee bit more and we can talk about the other story afterwards if folk are still around. I just want to touch very briefly on the impact at an organizational level when civility increases. And this is work done by Crew in 2011. And there's a whole bunch of things that happen. If you're at the top end as an organization of the civility scale, you have increased employee satisfaction. That's great. You have increased trust in management. That's super cool because getting things done is a damn sight easier when people trust management. You have increased employee engagement if you're at the top end of the civility scale. And we know that employee engagement is a number one predictor across all KPIs. And you have increased employee retention. And that's good because that saves you a ton of money because turning over staff is expensive and people are not efficient when they first come into organizations. A couple of things go down. First one is equal opportunity lawsuits go down in America in 2011. That was saving about $2.2 million a year for the most civil organizations versus the least ones. But that is completely dwarfed by sickness. Sickness, absence went down hugely in people in the most civil organizations, and that was to the tune of $26.2 million a year. And I think that's just pretty stunning. And there's a couple of reasons why. First one is long-term exposure to stressful environments increases cortisol, makes you sicker. And the second one is that people just don't want to go to work in stressful, hostile environments, and they choose to take more sick days as a consequence of that. So let's pull it all together. This is 1959. It's the Western General Hospital in Edinburgh, and the NHS is the grand total of 11 years old, which just blows my mind. And that's my mum. On my mum's left is Charlotte, on her right is Julie, and Julie died a year and a half ago, and Charlotte died just at Christmas past. And up until then, if Charlotte had been across from Canada, you would have seen my mum and Charlotte and Julie having coffee together in the Guile shopping centre later on. And they were just wonderful, wonderful, brilliant, forged in healthcare, octogenarians, spiky, full of opinion. And I love them to bits. But back in 1959, twice a day, it was my mum's job to empty the ashtrays, one of which was built into every single bedside cabinet. When I went to uni in the 1980s, there were still the holes for the ashtrays. And doctors would tell patients that smoking was good for the nerves. And I like to think that my mum would walk up behind them and go to the patient, "Do you smoke?" And the patient would go, "No." My mum would go, "There you go. Would you like to try one?" She hates it when I say that, eh? And then what happened? Well, Professor Doll came along and we discovered the terrible toll that tobacco takes on health. And we, as healthcare professionals, stopped smoking so much. And gradually, with a whole bunch of other levers, we've got to the stage where smoking is relatively rare in society. So now it's 2022. We're beginning to understand the impact that behavior has on performance. And that's great. What a wonderful opportunity. Because by choosing to behave in ways that value and respect individuals, then we get the chance of people performing at their personal peak. When we have individuals performing at their peak and they come together as teams and then they share information, we have the opportunity for teams to perform at their peak. And that leads to better results for patients, for staff, and for organizations. Or in other words, civility saves lives. Guys, thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've kept anybody over a wee bit extra. I will tell you the story in just a minute about leadership and the impact of rudeness on leadership in as much as we know about it. But I just wanted to get to the end and give people a chance to ask any questions if they had any questions, or do you just want me to tell you the story of me being an arse? Yeah, okay, Jenny. That was pretty clear that Jenny wants to hear about me being an arse. All right. So I tell this story for a bunch of reasons. The first is that there's a risk in talking about this stuff that I'm going to come across as sanctimonious, and I'm not. The second is to say that we all can make idiots of ourselves, and we all will, and under the right circumstances, it happens in a very odd way. But the third bit, the most important bit, is there's almost no evidence about the impact of being rude and being hostile on the people who are being rude and being hostile. There's lots of evidence on the recipient. There's lots of evidence on witnesses, but the evidence on the person who's being rude and hostile is far more lacking, and it's very difficult to study. So here's the story. So it's a few weeks ago, and I'd love to tell it was years, but it is just weeks ago. And I was working, and the way we work is to stand in the middle of the department. You can see a lot of it, and people come and they consult with me, and I go and then see patients with them. And I saw this patient beginning to fall in a bed. So I saw it at the same time as medical registrar saw it, and we rushed into this room, put on our PPE, caught the patient, stopped them falling to the ground, got them into a better position, got them safe, secure. I came out, I washed my hands, done all that stuff, and I was feeling a wee bit heroic. You know, it was just one of those moments when you go and you do a good thing, and I'm feeling, well, I'm glad you didn't fall, and I'm glad that we managed to stop that. And I walked into resus. Our resus is a long, thin resus with 6 beds, which are just lined up next to each other. And there's a kind of corridor that walks towards me. And I look down the corridor. And I say a corridor, it's just only a corridor because there's curtains around the base. And there's this guy walking towards me. And he's got a mask on, but his mask is going under his chin, supporting his chin like that. And I saw him and he's walking towards me, and I made the internationally recognized sign of you've forgotten to put your mask up, which is, I did that. And I got my mask on. I'm smiling underneath my mask. And he looked at me and he went, and I'm like, okay, I can cope with that. So, and then I said, you need to put your mask on. And I said that because A, he needed to put his mask on, and B, because I knew there was a patient with COVID who was being nebulized right next to where he was standing, behind a curtain that he couldn't see. And we don't normally nebulize people in that space, but we had to for this patient. And his response to me when I said, you need to put your mask on, was, I'm just leaving. And I had a complete sense of humor failure. And my response at that moment was, put on your fucking mask. Which actually generally works quite effectively if I ever get to that level with people, I have found. And he, honest to God, he walked up to me, he eyeballed me, and he said, not until you say please. And at this point, honestly, in my head, I was thinking, stuff it, get COVID, I don't care. Which passed very quickly. And then he walked off. And so I partially instigated that. I wasn't the version of myself that I'd want to be. But then I left resus and I walked into the main part of the department. And very quickly, 2 people came and asked me questions. Could I think? Could I bring the stuff that they were talking to me about together and come up with a decent, coherent plan? I absolutely couldn't. I could not think. I realized after a couple of people come and talk to me, I thought, your brain's just not working. And I had to leave. And we know this, we know this anecdotally, we know this about ourselves, but I had to leave and go and have a cup of tea. Actually, what I did is I went, had a cup of tea, and I phoned his boss and spoke to his boss about it, because this guy didn't work in my department. He was a registrar from one of the other teams. And I phoned his boss and dealt with it through that route. And then I calmed down, and then I was able to come back. Now, bits of that story are a wee bit funny, but I think it's illustrative of what happens to us as senior people if we start to lose the rag, that there is an impact on us as well. And our ability to think can be diminished in these settings just as much as the recipients and the witnesses. But it's not studied. It's not studied because it's nearly impossible to study. I've been thinking about it a lot, about how you might go about it. But the bottom line to it is, probably this is a shared experience. Other people might recognize that. And that when we get to the stage of we ourselves are behaving in an uncivil fashion with folk, it's probably diminishing us as well. So that's the purpose of telling you that story. I'm not proud of it. I'm not proud of how I behaved. But it may add very slightly to the sort of global understanding of the different people that are impacted by this stuff. Now, there we go. Told you about me swearing and doing it in quite a scary and quite Scottish way, I think. I think sort of letting my voice drop a wee bit and becoming like Mr. Hostile. And I'm only wee, so I'm 5'7". And I just look like this angry wee rotund Scottish man trying to get control of a situation. It's not good. Hey, anyhow, there we go. That was the added bit I wanted to tell you about, but we didn't quite have time to get it in the hour. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anything in the chat, Elizabeth?
No questions yet, but a couple of just sharing similar stories. Karen at the start was talking about when she was a scrub nurse and she was hit over the back of her hand with a pair of scissors, and on another occasion a surgeon kicked her to get her to move out the way. Somebody reflected that on the flip side of being a negative experience is that you can maybe show kindness and understanding and respect, and that might be passed along to others too.
Yeah, that's kind of higher level behaviour. That when you're able to. Hey Jenny, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, I think that there's been a lot of we've lost a lot with masks because you can't see a person's facial expressions. So we either don't look at people really because you can't smile at them and you don't want to appear hostile. But I notice even in clinics, I work as an eating disorder dietitian, that you can't even convey empathy hardly. I know our eyes tell a lot of stuff, but in terms of your facial expression, you could be swearing under your mask for all that person knows, as long as you don't move your mouth too much, and I think we've lost a lot by wearing masks.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, wearing masks, and the other thing that we've lost a lot through is doing meetings over Zoom and Teams and stuff, because of that tiny little delay that sits within it. The natural rhythm of having conversations with people changes a wee bit, and it means that sometimes you get folk talking over the top of each other, or these uncomfortable pauses when somebody else has got a wee bit time at the back, a wee bit lag on their end. Karen, you were going to ask something.
Yeah, I always find it quite surprising when, from a witness's point of view, you're witnessing something and you don't intervene. That you're witnessing bullying or you're witnessing bad behaviour, and it would be easier from somebody in the outskirts to say something to the person who's receiving it because they're almost in shock. But it doesn't seem to happen that often. So I just wondered if you had any insight.
Yeah, there's a ton of work done on this. We want bystanders to intervene. The truth is that oftentimes this stuff is done down a hierarchy. It's often done by somebody who's quite powerful. We know, and there's work come out of Aston University around this, Jeremy Dawson did it, that the way that we treat one person that we're more likely to treat the next person the same way. So as a bystander, if you see somebody who's having a negative interaction with someone else and then you intervene, there's a pretty decent chance they're going to behave towards you that way as well. And one of the things that happens within organizations is that people who are senior, and Jenny, sorry, Karen, you, me, we would be senior people. People who are senior think other people, we have a tendency to think other people should be able to intervene. But we, of course, are looking at it through the perspective of our seniority. We're allowed to behave in certain ways. We are given permission to intervene in these kind of situations. And I suspect that if you're an HCA and what you're looking at is me being, if I'm being a nurse, to a band 5 nurse, expecting the HCA to intervene there is a huge ask. And I think people find it much more difficult to intervene than we think they should, but that's because there's significant risk that comes with it, with intervening. There are various bits of work about active bystander work around what happens when somebody does intervene. It's not as bad as folk think it might be on average, but some of the interactions are really negative. And that's enough to turn people off from feeling able to interrupt, feeling able to try and do something about it. There's an evidence-based way around this, sort of helping people to let somebody know the impact of their behaviour, and that comes from a guy called Jerry Hickson in Vanderbilt, which is in Nashville. In fact, that picture of Shuley that was in the presentation was us going to America on a holiday, which, as far as I was personally concerned, basically revolved around going to Vanderbilt for a 1-hour meeting with Jerry Hickson. In the time before when we used to use Zoom and everything else. So you go and see somebody. It's only a few years ago. Isn't that weird? Anyway, I went to Vanderbilt to see Jerry Hickson to talk about this, and super quickly, the way that we tend to ask people to deal with stuff in the NHS and most businesses is, if you and I have a crappy interaction, Karen, and I'm your junior and you're my boss, and that finishes, and you walk away from it and I walk away from it, we know the evidence on this is that basically the bosses don't think it was a bad interaction. They usually think it was okay, but the recipient of it is feeling pretty terrible about it. And there's tons of evidence about this. And what we tend to do is, if I then go and complain and say, I don't like the way Karen was talking to me, organisations say, well, we're going to give you some training. We're going to give you some training in crucial conversations. We're going to give you the extra module in difficult conversations. And you know what? We have our gold star Speaking Truth to Power module. And they give me all this education personally. And then feel as though I've been tooled up to go and have the conversation with you. The truth is, though, that you can tool people up to do this, and organizations have to do this. But I still believe that you deliberately hurt me in that conversation. And we believe this with about 90% certainty. Kruger and Epley researched this. So I believe that in that conversation, you deliberately hurt me. That was your purpose. That means that if I'm going to come and talk to you about it, that I'm effectively coming saying, Karen, you know how you tried to hurt me in that conversation? It worked. Please don't do it again. I'm basically empowering my aggressor, saying, yeah, that does work. So what Jerry Hickson did was he said, what would happen if we change the dynamic here? And he was looking specifically at how doctors treat other people. What if we change the dynamic? And instead of expecting the person who the doctor has spoken to speak to them, we have a third person, a second messenger. And this is a long answer. I'm really sorry. It's quite a big topic. So the second messenger, what if we get the second messenger to then go and speak to Karen? And the second messenger is a peer of the first person, and they go and have a conversation. And I'll just really quickly run you through the conversation. They're going to have a conversation with you, which, and I'm sorry, this sounds like, Karen the evil at this point, but it's just because you start the conversation, They come and have the chat with you, and they have two purposes when they have the chat with you. The first is to look after you, to make sure you're all right, because we know that people who distress other people are often distressed themselves, and that they don't normally notice it, that they've distressed other people. So 1, to look after you. 2, to let you know that in the interaction with me, that I was quite distressed. And it's not to judge you on that. It is the transfer of a piece of information that is done in a professional, compassionate way. And they started running a system like this about 15, 20 years ago in Vanderbilt. They started off with 12 people. And they have 150 who do it in Vanderbilt now, but they run the same system in 150 to 200 hospitals in America, or at least that's where they were when I went across and saw Jerry about this. And the evidence on this was that at that time they had done 37,000 of those cup of coffee conversations, those low-level conversations where peer-to-peer messenger lets somebody know that their behaviour hadn't gone down well. After a single cup of coffee conversation, they only had 2,000 people from that initial 37,000 who repeat offended. Those repeat offenders, those 2,000, had a second cup of coffee conversation. They actually wrapped that up with a bit of data for a lot of these guys saying how people found them to work with. Again, it was delivered in a non-judgmental fashion. And after that, they were down to 267. That is the first level at which there was an authority intervention that included either their boss or HR. And basically what this said to me is, of this 37,000 interactions, they got down to 267. And that was over that 10 to 15 years, on average, 1 to 2 people over that whole period of time per organisation going through conduct proceedings. And that's totally mind-blowing to me, that by choosing a different way of approaching these problems, one that seeks to underpin behaviour and say our values are, good values, and that we want to underpin a culture of safety and of excellence and of learning, and we do it this way, that you can have really positive outcomes. Now, the statistics hide a few bits of things, because obviously if somebody breaks the law, then the police got involved and a whole bunch of people leave organisations that are going to call them out for this stuff. But nonetheless, that to me was just stunning data. And you can read about it if you were to put Vanderbilt CORS, CORS, and PARS, PARS, into if you were to put that into Google, you'd find the stuff, or I can send it to Elizabeth. Sorry, massive long answer, Karen.
No, thanks very much. That was helpful. I just remember, when I was more junior, speaking to a group of medical staff, and on 2 separate occasions, one of them was very rude, but nobody else said anything, and I was the most junior person in the room. And it almost made it worse that nobody said anything. A couple of people emailed me afterwards, but not at the time.
Yeah. I mean, and I think people are just fearful to speak up in those settings, and it's kind of understandable. It's not good, but it's kind of understandable. And that we still need to find ways where we can make sure that somebody's having a chat with those guys at some point, because the risk is that we all believe you will have people in your organization that everybody thinks is a bastard. You'll have them, and there will be people who are utterly convinced that somebody's spoken to them. They know that's how they come across. They know that. And what I've found, so I do work one-on-one work with people. Usually, they're usually male, and they're usually doctors, and they're usually very senior. And they've been investigated and found to be truly offensive to everybody around them. Everybody thinks they're deliberately offensive. I speak to these guys, they had no idea. And that's mind-blowing, because you can't believe that these people don't know it, because it's become their legend, it's their reputation. Everybody thinks of them like this, and they are devastated. They are actually extremely vulnerable at that moment in time when they hear about this. And some of them make amazing changes in their lives to be somebody different to that. And they are horrified that they've been seen like that. I've got one guy who thought he was best friends with all these people, and then there's this massive report into his behaviour. And I was so worried about him when I first had contact with him. I'd never met him before. I was so worried about him that I phoned him a number of times over the first week, when I would not normally have contact with somebody, for about 2 weeks after the first time I chatted to them about this kind of stuff. And it just made me stop and think that we think other people know how they're seen. We think that they're deliberately acting that way. And then there are so many people that are just not. And particularly when we get super stressed, we sometimes don't recognize how we're coming across to other folk. I had an intervention a couple of weeks ago where I had to go and speak to somebody about how they'd left another member of staff feeling. And I went and I spoke to him and I said, listen, just to let you know, Pauline's upset in the office. And the response of the person I spoke to was, what the fuck has she got to be upset about? I was like, oh, dude. I said, and then I said to him, actually, he's upset. She's upset because of the interaction that happened in that meeting. I had no idea. None at all. Yet everybody thought that he had deliberately behaved in that way. And, you know, I think there's a space there for a bit of kindness towards people. It's quite difficult to access, and it's impossible for the recipient to be kind, more or less, for most recipients, unless you're like the Dalai Lama or something. But if you have a second messenger, they can be a wee bit kinder. And that's how that works. Elizabeth.
There was a question from Claire McDerrick asking about your registrar conversation, Chris, when the person wouldn't put the mask on. So after that incident, she's asking, were you ever able to speak to the person or have any sort of clear the air type thing so that there was something good coming out of it?
Yeah. So I would always seek to have that conversation afterwards. On this particular occasion, I have not been able to do so because the person that I had the interaction with is a locum, who has perhaps left a wee bit of a trail of devastation behind him, and who has left and gone to another continent to work. So I wasn't able to have that conversation. You know what? If I'd known in advance that this was somebody who had problems with their interactions with other people, if I'd known that in advance, I would have approached the interaction a wee bit differently, I think. I'd like to think I'd have approached it a wee bit differently. But you don't know. You don't know what's going on in other people's worlds. And, you know, maybe the guy had just, you know, he's leaving. He's just had enough. He's sick of it. And he's basically sticking two fingers up at everything and everyone. And I just happen to be part of that. So I haven't managed to speak to him. In the past, I have. And in the past, every single time that I have been and apologized, and there are three occasions when somebody's come and told me about stuff. Excuse me, 3 occasions in the 10 years when I've been working where I work currently. On every single one of those occasions, I've gone on to have really good working relationships with those people. And they have come to me, and when they've had other issues in their careers, and, you know, strong professional bonds have been created. One of the things that we know about saying sorry and having these conversations is that, and this is another one that's kind of slightly mind-blowing things, is that if people think you're nice, if they like you, and then you behave like an arse, if you then go back and apologize having behaved like an arse, they like you even more. Now, I'm not suggesting that you take this tactic up in order to be liked more by people, but the act of saying sorry, the act of showing some contrition, is very powerful. And there's a parallel that sits here between saying sorry and saying thank you. When we go and say sorry to somebody, and when we say thank you to somebody, in both those occasions, what we're doing is we are recognizing another human being as somebody who has value, and we are acknowledging an interaction that we had in one case that hadn't gone well, and we're acknowledging our responsibility within that. And in the other case, they've done something for us and we're saying thank you to them. One of the hardest things for human beings to accept is to not be seen. And, you know, you sometimes hear kids talking about, I see you. And I never really got it until I started thinking about some of this stuff. And just a silly wee story. I was in a hospital and I was doing some work with the radiology department, and I met their clinical director, and the pair of us walked pretty much the length of the hospital to go to a meeting. Every single door she went through, she just let swing behind her. She didn't look once to see who was behind her. We arrived at the place for the meeting. She didn't know where the meeting was, and the receptionist was talking to somebody. And I'd spent the whole walk there looking behind me, trying to make sure we weren't sort of knocking people out in our wake. And we got to the place where we're going, and the receptionist having a chat with somebody. They are clearly talking about something work related. The person I'm with literally stood between them and said, "Excuse me, I need to know where this is." And I'm like dying, because although I swear I just wouldn't treat people like that. And I'm spent the entire time looking behind me, and then I had to stop and say sorry to the two people who she'd just talked to. And I think when people treat other people the way that she did as we went through there, as invisible effectively, people hate it. They absolutely detest it. Whereas the best leaders are people who see other people, who recognize other people, who are acknowledging their presence, and then asking them for their perspective on stuff. Not if you're walking along the corridor, obviously, but people who see those folk around them and then take the time to recognize them. They validate their existence. One of the things that we do as people who are senior is that people really care about how we treat them. And when we acknowledge them, when we say hello, people are quite taken aback by that sometimes. You'll all know, I mean, the stuff that came out yesterday, the Sue Gray report, yeah, there's all the stuff about drinking, but the bit that I really hate about it is how people were talking to, I mean, I hate loads of it, but how they were talking to the cleaners, and the dismissive, derogatory, these people are not important kind of aspect that came out of this just felt awful. I felt awful for them. And there's lots of other reasons to feel awful about it. But we know that people who treat the folk around them with respect then get more information, and they're able to make wiser decisions. That's not the reason to do it. It's just the right thing to do, is to treat people with respect when possible. But I just think that there's all sorts of parallels that are kicking about in there, and it's mostly about seeing people and hearing their perspectives. And we're in a wonderfully permissive position as leaders around this stuff, because we can facilitate people speaking to us and telling us what they think about things.
Just lots of nice comments in the chat about it's been a great session today and very thought-provoking. Lots of nice reflective messages and things, Chris. I'll try and pull that all together for you at the end so you can see the good feedback.
So I'm figuring we're just about done. Would it be okay if I tell you one last thing really quickly? And it's I think a nice thing. And basically it goes like this. So I get invited to be on committees and all sorts of stuff, and I don't do it because I don't have the time, and it's a pain in the backside often. And I was invited to be part of the National NHS in England Health and Wellbeing Strategic Group. And I said no a couple of times because it involved going to London. Then COVID hit, and it all went online. And COVID hit, and all my meetings and stuff like this all just vanished from my diary. And I had lots of spare time, so I thought I'll do this. And it's a government quango, and it's populated by people who are super high level from outside the NHS. So, you know, people off the executive board of BP and Shell and the Rand Corporation and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, what the hell am I doing here? In fact, I sometimes wonder if there's a Chris Turner who weeps into their cornflakes every morning because he or she wasn't invited to be part of this group, and health and well-being has been their whole life. Anyway, I'm there, or I was there because it's gone now. But I obviously had to go and read a lot around health and well-being because I'm totally granular. I am interested in you and me and our interaction. These guys were interested in organisational interactions, and were prepared to talk about introducing legislation in Parliament. That's the level of interaction that they were thinking at. And I did tons of reading. And the single most important thing that I came across in all the reading that I did is this, that the most important person determining what sort of day we're going to have and how engaged we are at work is our immediate line manager. When our immediate line manager is in a good place, our chances of having a good day at work are high. If our immediate line manager is in a really crappy place, then our chances of having a good day at work just diminished massively. And that's a bit annoying. Got to say, that is a bit annoying, that the person above us is determining our day to such a large extent. But there's a flip to it, and this is the flip. On the other side of this, it means that the single most important person determining how good a day our immediate line reports are going to have is us. Who we are to them is going to determine whether they, to a large extent, whether they have a good day or a bad day at work. And I think that is a wonderful opportunity. I think it's lovely. It means that when my registrar comes to me or the F2 comes to me, that it's their interaction with me that is going to determine how good a day that they are going to have more than anything else. And that means I can choose to behave in ways which make them see the purpose in what we do, where they feel more engaged in work, where they learn better, where they perform better, where they feel better about themselves. And I think that's a great thing. We all have that ability. When people come to us, we can determine what sort of day they have. And that lifts my soul a wee bit. So I just thought I'd share that as the last thought. Guys, it's been a complete privilege. Really, really, really lovely to be here and to get the chance to chat about this stuff. I'm so glad that I came along at a stage in science when we actually had some data around it, because once you know that there's data around it and it's not just you, not just me, it's all of us, we feel like this and this has an impact on us as individuals, teams and organizations, then I think that opens the door to us behaving in different ways and having better outcomes for everyone. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a lovely afternoon. I'm going to go and see a colleague who's been off sick. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can get me through the website, by the way, if anybody wants to ask questions.
Thank you.
See you now. In fact, I'll hang about for a second, Elizabeth, actually, because just in case there's anybody who wants to ask a last question. But
No problem.
this is where you catch all the people who are on the other side of the room doing the ironing, or or fallen asleep. I was in a stunningly boring meeting yesterday. We stopped recording yet?
Oh, wait till I no. Good point.
I'll tell you about my stunningly boring meeting in a second.